His Excellency, Mr. Dennis Francis, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen.
That was Philemon Yang, the former Prime Minister of Cameroon and the UN General Assembly's new president for the 79th session of the United Nations, which was declared open this past Tuesday by this year's president. Yang was sworn in following the closing of last year's session by Dennis Francis. Francis had expressed gratitude for support by developing countries, including China, and called on the international community to deepen its practice of multilateralism. President Yang had this to say about the outgoing President Francis.
My sincere thanks go to President Francis, under whose leadership the General Assembly navigated a year filled with great challenges and uncertainty, guided by his watchwords of peace, progress, prosperity, and sustainability.
Caleb Maupin is an independent journalist based in New York. Among his other assignments there, he covers the United Nations. He will be in attendance this week and next as this year's session of the UN's work begins. That will include a visit by various heads of state to New York to address the General Assembly in what's called the General Debate. Caleb, thanks for joining us. This is the 79th session since the founding of the United Nations in 1945. For the first time in those 79 years, the U.S. and Russia are at war with each other. It's pretty clear that that's the case to all involved. And in addition to that, we have had the worst publicized, if not the worst in absolute terms, genocide since the end of World War II. The two things that the UN was supposed to remedy, war and genocide, as a matter of fact, it is probably at its most difficult time since World War II. That's the context for what's coming this coming week. What do you think about this? Where are we at?
Well, at this point, they've made clear that Russian President Putin will not be attending, but Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, will be. Russian President Putin has not felt safe to attend the United Nations General Assembly since 2015. You'll remember when he came in 2015 and he spoke about how the USA was spreading destabilization and color revolutions around the world, spoke very eloquently when Barack Obama was president. But I think there's serious concern on the part of Russian officials that if Vladimir Putin came to the United States, he would probably be arrested because of this Interpol arrest warrant that has been put out, and that U.S. officials don't seem to be respecting international law when it comes to Russian officials and Russian individuals. But it appears that Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov will be coming, and he will be representing Russia at the United Nations General Assembly, as he has done for the past several years. And I think that, the conflict in Ukraine will be on the agenda, obviously, and that's a proxy conflict being fueled by the United States. The ongoing bombardment of Gaza and the crimes of Israel, which have been so widely condemned by the UN General Assembly in vote after vote. Outside of the Western world, there is no support, almost virtually no support for Israel and what it's doing at this point, and there will be a condemnation of Israel heard from the UN General Assembly as well, I'm sure. And the United States would very much like to, turn the UN General Assembly into a platform to condemn Russia and increasingly to condemn China, to condemn North Korea and other countries. But I don't think they're going to have much success because Israel seems to be a cause that is dominating the international scene at this point, and the United States is on the opposite side of the bulk of the world when it comes to that conflict.
Yeah, there's a couple of marker votes that are held almost ritualistically in the General Assembly. I don't know, what is it, 193 members today? I don't know, it's a little fluid around the edges, the number of members, but almost the entire global community is a member of the United Nations at this moment. And every year, there's been, for 30 years now, there's been a vote on the question of the U.S., to call it sanctions is to lend it a legitimacy it doesn't have. The U.S. stranglehold and blockade, basically, on Cuba's economy gets an up and down vote among those 193 members. And the vote has been consistently for decades. The United States and either or Israel Palau and or the Marshall Islands, which are basically military colonies of the United States, on one side that they approve of these so-called sanctions, and on the other side, somewhere in the vicinity of 110 to 120 countries condemning them outright, and then those that are U.S. allies that are afraid to speak outside of the box abstaining or not voting. Israel is another second vote for the United States on any number of issues, not just including what happens in the Middle East, but that. And so it's an interesting place to measure temperature. Now suddenly this horrible genocide is on the table. It's an interesting political situation for the U.S.
Indeed. And I mean, the conflict in Ukraine is going to be on the focus of everyone's mind. I mean, if that can be de-escalated, if there could be a diplomatic solution to that conflict, that would bring the world much safer. And I think that there are a number of countries that have spoken up and said that while, they may not agree with Russia, they may not be solidly where Russia is at, countries like India, for example, they realize that this conflict needs to be resolved and that the approach of the Western countries, which is just escalating and continuing to escalate the conflict, that's not serious, and that you can't resolve the conflict without sitting down with Russia. I thought it was interesting that Donald Trump, he has refused to say he wants to, he wants Ukraine to quote unquote win. And he stood firm on that. He said, no, I want the conflict to stop. This commitment to Ukraine winning. I mean, what would it mean for Ukraine to win? In their playbook, winning means, seizing Crimea, which has been the host of a Russian military base for hundreds of years. It would mean, just completely removing and forcing the Donbass region that declared independence out. I mean, that's not going to happen.
Right. Yeah. I mean, one of the things is that they want the eastern third of the former Ukraine, which is populated 70% by Russians, to surrender, basically, because that's an uprising. That's not a Russian invasion. Those people wanted to leave a country that declared them persona non grata, basically. Right. And so that, the demands that are being made by the Ukrainian government as proxy for the United States are not intended to make peace there, because the United States is making war there intentionally with an eye towards regime change in Russia. And unless that's achieved, there is no settlement to this politically for the United States or for Ukraine.
You are absolutely correct about that. And I think most of the world would like to see a resolution to the conflict. And that I think even the bulk of interest in the United States would like that. We have a particular faction that is behind Kamala Harris and behind Joe Biden, and they have been determined to escalate the conflict with Russia as much as possible for geopolitical gain. And they want to weaken Russia economically. They want to use the conflict to isolate Russia from the world. And they've been very unsuccessful in both of those areas. The Russian economy is very strong, and Russia continues to trade with countries around the world. They're not isolated. So I think that that being a defining position of the Biden-Harris wing of the American elite, that is causing a lot of problems. I mean, if you look at the rise of the fact that the Alternative for Germany party is rising in Germany and the New Right is rising in Europe, that's opposition to this kind of NATO rallying crusade on the part of Western leaders against Russia, and that we're seeing the United States become the country that is weakened. I think it's also interesting that Donald Trump talked about, getting rid of sanctions because they're weakening the dollar. And he's right. In the long term, the dollar is going to lose out if the USA continues to just, sanction countries willy-nilly. In the 1990s, the USA did have the ability to just completely isolate countries, and Cuba really suffered, North Korea really suffered, and Iraq really suffered from U.S. sanctions that just devastated countries because the world was very unilateral at that point. But we're heading toward a multipolar world, and Russia and China are a rising pole of influence, and the BRICS are rising, and there's alternative models of global trade. And we could be a much more prosperous country in the United States if we would join this new economy rather than trying to crush it and isolate it and fight against it.
Caleb, thank you so much for your time, and we'd like to speak with you again, perhaps over the course of the general debate with the leaders of the world come in and chat about all the things that are happening at the UN General Assembly, and we really appreciate your time and your expertise.
Sure thing. Always a pleasure.
For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.